They had been married for 6 years. On the surface, their lives seemed like the epitome of perfection. A beautifully decorated home in the suburbs, well-paying jobs that gave them financial stability, and weekend brunches with friends who often commented on how perfect they were together. It was the kind of life anyone would envy. Yet beneath the flawless exterior, there were cracks, subtle enough to escape notice from anyone but those living within the marriage. She glanced at the clock while sipping her morning coffee. 7:15 a.m., the same as every other weekday. He was already out of the house, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne and a hurried note on the counter. "Don't forget dinner with the Petersons tonight." It wasn't a love note, not the kind he used to leave when they were newlyweds. But then again, he didn't have time for that anymore. Neither of them did. The routine had become their life. Wake up, work, eat dinner, sleep, repeat. Conversations had turned transactional. Discussions about bills, schedules, and grocery lists. She missed the laughter, the spontaneous road trips, the moments when his eyes lit up just by looking at her. Now, those eyes were always glued to his phone or computer screen. She told herself it was normal. Every marriage cooled down after a while. Passion wasn't sustainable, was it? Her friends all said the same thing. It's just life. You're lucky he's a good man. And he was. He worked hard, paid attention to details when it mattered, and had never given her any reason to question his loyalty. But something was missing, a void she couldn't quite define but felt deeply, like a dull ache that never went away. It was during one of these dull mornings that she met him. It wasn't planned, nor did it feel significant at first. A new client at work. A man who had the kind of presence that made people pause. He wasn't traditionally handsome, but there was something about him. His voice, the way he carried himself, the way his eyes seemed to see right through her polite smiles. He was confident but not arrogant, charming without trying too hard. Their first conversation was purely professional. She walked him through a presentation, answered his questions, and smiled when he complimented her clarity. "You make everything seem so simple," he'd said, his tone light but sincere. She dismissed it as harmless, just another compliment in a corporate world filled with them. But later that night, while sitting across from her husband at dinner, she found herself replaying his words. The next few weeks blurred into a series of fleeting encounters. She would see him in the office hallway, exchanging pleasantries that seemed to carry an undercurrent of something more. Their emails became slightly more personal, peppered with jokes or offhand comments about shared interests. He mentioned a book he loved, and she found herself picking up a copy, eager to understand a piece of him. At home, she began noticing things she'd ignored before. The way her husband barely looked up from his phone when she walked into the room. The way their conversations felt like obligations rather than connections. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself of all the good things he did. But the comparison lingered in her mind, unspoken but undeniable. Then came the day that shifted everything. It was raining, and she was stuck at work later than usual. As she waited for the rain to let up, he appeared, holding an umbrella and offering to walk her to her car. It was such a simple gesture, one her husband would have done without thinking in their early days. She hesitated, knowing it was unnecessary, but something in his eyes made her say yes. The walk was brief, filled with light conversation, but when they reached her car, he lingered. "You seem different lately," he said, his voice soft but probing. She froze, unsure how to respond. "Not unhappy," he added quickly, "just like you're looking for something." The word struck a chord she hadn't realized was there. She brushed it off with a laugh, but later that night, lying in bed next to her husband, his words echoed in her mind. She wasn't looking for something, or was she? She loved her husband, didn't she? Love was about commitment, about weathering the storms together. But why did it feel like she was weathering them alone? The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. Her husband was already in the shower, humming a tune she didn't recognize. She stared at the empty space beside her, feeling the weight of her thoughts pressing down like a heavy blanket. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that the life she had built, the one everyone envied, might not be enough. It wasn't a decision or even a realization, just a flicker of a thought, one she quickly pushed aside. But it was there, lingering, waiting for her to confront it. The first time they met outside of the office wasn't planned, or at least that's what she told herself. She was walking out of the coffee shop near her workplace, balancing a hot cup in one hand and her phone in the other, when he appeared. He smiled when he saw her, a natural smile that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. They exchanged a few casual words, and before she realized it, she had agreed to sit down for a few minutes. The conversation was easy, almost too easy. It wasn't just the way he listened, but the way he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts. He asked about her favorite books, her hobbies, the things that excited her. She found herself laughing, sharing stories she hadn't thought about in years. When he spoke, there was no rush in his words, no sense that he was mentally elsewhere. He was present entirely and completely, and it was intoxicating. When they parted ways, she told herself it was nothing more than a friendly chat. But for the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't that she was unhappy with her life or her marriage. She loved her husband, didn't she? Yet, the idea of him seemed to fade when she thought about those moments in the coffee shop. She didn't want to admit it, but she craved that feeling again. The next time they spoke, it was over a string of emails. He wrote her about a book she'd mentioned, and she responded with a long paragraph about why it resonated with her. He replied almost immediately, not just acknowledging her words, but expanding on them, diving deeper into the themes and ideas she had barely touched on. She read his email 3 times before responding, feeling a strange mix of guilt and exhilaration. She began to notice the small details about him. The way his smile lingered when he talked to her, the way his tone softened when he asked about her day. He wasn't doing anything inappropriate. Not technically, but there was an undertone to their conversations that hadn't been there before. And the truth was, she didn't want to stop it. When he suggested grabbing lunch one day, she hesitated for a moment, but agreed before she could think too hard about it. It wasn't a date, she told herself, just 2 colleagues sharing a meal. But when she arrived at the restaurant and saw him waiting for her, a part of her knew it was something more. They talked about everything and nothing, work, travel, dreams they'd once had but let go of. He spoke about his own life with a blend of honesty and humor that made her feel comfortable, almost too comfortable. At one point, he reached across the table to brush a stray hair from her face, and she froze. It was such a small gesture, but it felt intimate in a way she hadn't experienced in years. That night, as she lay in bed, her husband's arm draped over her waist, she couldn't stop thinking about him. She hated herself for it, for the way her heart raced when she remembered his touch, his laugh, the way his eyes seemed to linger just a little too long on hers. She told herself it was nothing, just a passing infatuation that would fade with time. But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed it. Their next meeting wasn't accidental, though they pretended it was. He called her to discuss a project, and the conversation drifted, as it always seemed to, into personal territory. When he suggested meeting in person to brainstorm, she knew she should say no, but she didn't. They met at a quiet bar after work, one far enough away from the office that no one would recognize them. She told herself it was harmless, just 2 people enjoying each other's company. But when he placed his hand over hers on the table, she didn't pull away. "I don't want to make things complicated for you," he said, his voice low and sincere. She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're not," she replied, though she knew it wasn't true. They sat there for a moment, the air thick with unspoken words. When he finally leaned in, she didn't stop him. The kiss was brief, almost hesitant, but it left her breathless. As she drove home that night, the guilt began to creep in, but it was overshadowed by something else, a sense of exhilaration she hadn't felt in years. At home, her husband was waiting for her, asking how her day had been. She smiled and told him it was fine, all the while feeling like a stranger in her own skin. She wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything and beg for forgiveness, but she couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. In the days that followed, she tried to pull away, to put distance between herself and the man who had become far more than just a colleague. But it was impossible. Every time she saw him, her resolve crumbled. They found excuses to meet, to talk, to be alone together. It wasn't just a physical connection, though that was undeniable. It was the way he made her feel alive, seen, understood. She told herself it wasn't real, that it was just a distraction from the monotony of her life. But with each passing day, it became harder to convince herself. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to find it again. The first time her husband asked about her late nights at work, she felt her stomach twist. His tone was casual, almost indifferent, as if he were making conversation rather than raising a concern. "You've been staying late a lot lately," he said, his eyes flicking up from the newspaper. She forced a smile, brushing it off with an excuse about deadlines and new responsibilities. He nodded, accepting her answer without pressing further, but the weight of his words lingered. She told herself there was no reason to feel guilty. After all, she wasn't doing anything wrong, at least not in a way that mattered. But the guilt was there, growing in the quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts. It wasn't just about what she had done, though that was bad enough. It was about what she wanted, the way her heart raced when she thought of the other man. The affair deepened, without her intending for it to. It was as if she were being swept along by a current she couldn't control. They began meeting more frequently, stealing moments in between work and home, always careful to avoid suspicion. Each meeting felt like a small rebellion, a break from the suffocating monotony of her life. With him, she could be someone else, someone free, unburdened by expectations and responsibilities. But the secrecy took its toll. She found herself lying more often, creating elaborate stories to explain her absences. Her husband, though not outwardly suspicious, started asking more questions. "Are you okay?" he asked one night as they sat on the couch, his hand resting lightly on hers. "You've seemed distant lately." "I'm fine," she replied quickly, too quickly. She could see the doubt in his eyes, but he didn't push. That was the thing about him. He trusted her, maybe too much. The realization only made her feel worse. The guilt began to manifest in other ways: shortness of breath, restless nights, a constant knot in her stomach. She started avoiding her husband, retreating to the bedroom earlier and pretending to fall asleep before he came to bed. When he tried to hold her, she stiffened, unable to meet his gaze. She told herself it was temporary, that she just needed time to figure things out. But deep down, she knew she was only delaying the inevitable. One evening, after a particularly heated argument about something trivial, he finally said what she had been dreading. "I feel like I'm losing you," he admitted, his voice breaking. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could she say? That he was right? That she didn't know how to fix it? Instead, she said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. He eventually left the room, and she sat there alone, staring at the empty space where he had been. Her relationship with the other man wasn't without its complications. He began to sense her hesitation, the way she pulled back just as things seemed to be moving forward. "You don't have to do this," he told her one night, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't want to be the reason you ruin your life." His words struck a nerve. Ruin her life. The phrase echoed in her mind, a reminder of what was at stake. But instead of pulling away, she found herself clinging to him even more. He was her escape, her refuge from a life that felt increasingly hollow. The turning point came when her husband found a text on her phone. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough to raise questions. "Who's this?" he asked, holding up the screen. Her heart stopped, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. "It's just a friend," she lied, her voice trembling. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. "A friend?" he repeated, his tone flat. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. He didn't press further, but the tension between them was palpable. For the first time, she realized how close she was to losing everything. And yet, even in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to end the affair. The paranoia set in shortly after. She began second-guessing every decision, every interaction. Was he watching her more closely? Did he know? She started deleting messages, avoiding certain places, taking extra precautions to cover her tracks. But the harder she tried to keep the two worlds separate, the more they seemed to collide. Her husband's suspicion grew, though he didn't say anything outright. It was in the way he looked at her, the questions he asked, the silences that stretched longer than they should. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. One night, as she stood in the kitchen, her phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at it quickly, her heart sinking when she saw his name. Her husband walked in at that exact moment, his eyes narrowing as he took in her reaction. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with something she couldn't quite place. "No one," she replied too quickly, slipping the phone into her pocket. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes was enough to make her stomach churn. The confrontation came the next day. He had gone through her phone while she was in the shower, finding messages she hadn't yet deleted. When she walked into the living room, he was sitting on the couch, her phone in his hand. "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" he asked, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. She froze, her mind racing for an explanation, an excuse, anything that might lessen the blow. But there was nothing she could say, nothing that could undo what had already been done. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But the words felt hollow, insufficient. He stared at her for a long moment before standing and walking out of the room, leaving her alone with the weight of her actions. She knew she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The life she had built, the life she had taken for granted, was crumbling around her, and she had no one to blame but herself. The silence in the house was deafening. Days had passed since her husband confronted her, and though they shared the same space, they felt like strangers. He didn't yell, didn't demand answers, didn't accuse her of anything outright. Instead, he retreated into himself, speaking only when necessary and avoiding her gaze whenever they crossed paths. His restraint hurt more than any shouting ever could. She tried to talk to him once, but the words died on her tongue. What could she say that would fix this? That she was sorry, that it had been a mistake, that it didn't mean anything, even though it had meant everything in the moment? She had betrayed him, and no amount of apologies would erase that fact. At work, she avoided the other man. It wasn't difficult. He seemed to sense the shift in her demeanor and kept his distance. But that didn't stop the memories from creeping in, invading her thoughts when she least expected it. The stolen moments, the quiet conversations, the way he made her feel alive, they all haunted her, mingling with the crushing guilt she carried like a stone in her chest. One afternoon he called her, his voice hesitant. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," he said, and for a moment, she almost let herself fall back into the comfort of his words. But she stopped herself, ending the call quickly and deleting his number. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. Her husband, meanwhile, seemed to be waging his own internal battle. She caught him staring at her more than once, his expression a mix of sadness and something she couldn't quite place, resentment perhaps, or disappointment. She wanted to reach out to him, to bridge the chasm that had grown between them, but every attempt felt futile. One night, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, he finally broke the silence. "Why?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. She froze, her fork hovering midair. "I don't know," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. It was the truth, or at least part of it. She didn't know why she had let it happen, why she had risked everything for something so fleeting. "That's not good enough," he said, his tone sharper now. "You owe me more than that." And he was right. He deserved an explanation, a reason, something that would make sense of the chaos she had unleashed. But the words wouldn't come. How could she explain the emptiness she had felt, the longing for something she couldn't even define? "I was lonely," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore." His eyes widened, and for a moment, she thought he might yell, might finally unleash the anger she knew he was holding back. But instead, he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You mattered to me," he said after a long pause. "You always mattered. I didn't know you felt that way." His words cut through her like a knife. She had been so consumed by her own feelings of neglect and dissatisfaction that she hadn't considered his perspective. Maybe he had been struggling too, trying to hold their lives together while she drifted further away. In the days that followed, they began to talk, really talk, for the first time in years. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always civil, but it was honest. She told him about the cracks she had felt in their marriage, the ways she had tried to ignore them until they became impossible to overlook. He admitted that he had noticed the distance, but didn't know how to bridge it, how to bring back the spark that had once defined their relationship. Their conversations were raw, filled with tears and painful truths, but they were necessary. Slowly, they began to find common ground, to acknowledge the roles they had both played in the breakdown of their marriage. It wasn't about assigning blame, but about understanding what had gone wrong and figuring out how to move forward. She cut all ties with the other man, not because her husband demanded it, but because she knew it was the only way to rebuild what they had lost. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she missed the escape he had offered, the way he had made her feel. But she knew that those feelings were fleeting, a distraction from the deeper issues she needed to face. Rebuilding trust was the hardest part. Her husband didn't forgive her overnight, and she didn't expect him to. There were moments of doubt, of suspicion, of anger that resurfaced when she least expected it. But there were also moments of hope, small but significant, that reminded her why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. They began to spend more time together, rediscovering the things that had once brought them joy. It was awkward at first, like learning to dance again after years of sitting on the sidelines. But with each step, they grew more comfortable, more confident in their ability to navigate this new version of their relationship. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. The scars of her betrayal would always be there, a reminder of what they had almost lost. But they were learning to live with them, to see them not as marks of failure, but as evidence of their resilience. In the quiet moments, when they sat together on the couch or shared a meal in silence, she felt a sense of gratitude she hadn't known before. For all the pain and heartache, they had found their way back to each other, not as the people they once were, but as the people they were becoming. It wasn't the ending she had envisioned, but it was an ending nonetheless, a new beginning, built on the fragile but unshakable foundation of love, forgiveness, and the promise of a better tomorrow.